Hi, Martin here with the Cancer Cachexia Society, and today we're going to talk about clinical trials for cachexia. We have Dr. Jose Garcia with us to help answer some questions. Dr. Garcia is a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Washington. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Martin. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you and the audience.
Great. So the question I want to start off with is, in the context of cancer cachexia, what is a clinical trial?
So in general terms, a clinical trial is a research study that is conducted to evaluate the safety and the effectiveness of a medical intervention, such as a new drug, but also nutritional supplements, exercise, a medical device, or a procedure in patients, in humans. An observational clinical trial is slightly different and is defined as a type of study in which researchers observe participants in their usual environment without really intervening or applying an experimental treatment. So they're just watching you as you go on. The primary goal of a clinical trial is to generate scientific data that can be used to inform medical practice and decision-making. So they're really, really important for advancing medical knowledge and improving patient care. So a lot of the things that we now use in the clinic were generated through these clinical trials. They're typically conducted according to a very careful design and detailed plan called the protocol. So there's a lot of work that goes behind this. This protocol typically outlines the objectives, the specific criteria for getting into the study or not being able to get into the study procedures, in the data analysis methods that we use. Sometimes we do clinical trials in healthy volunteers just to see how an intervention works and if there are any side effects. And sometimes we use patients that have a specific medical condition. So in this case, for instance, cancer, and that will depend on the trial purpose. Before we start the clinical trial, usually is review, and it has to get approval from ethics committees. Sometimes these are called IRB, or institutional review boards, and other regulatory agencies that may include the Food and Drug Administration here in the US, or FDA, sometimes the sponsor of the study, which is the organism or institution that provides the funding. That may be the National Institute of Health, NIH, the Department of Defense, Department of VA, or other industry sponsors, like pharmaceutical companies. This ensures that the study is conducted ethically and in compliance with established standards and regulations, which are already set forth in the field. I think it's very important for potential participants to understand that that being part of a clinical trial is completely voluntary, and that participants will be informed about the potential risks and benefits before they actually agree or consent to participate in a clinical trial.
Great, thanks for that explanation. So a lot of times when we look into clinical trials, we see that there are different phases. Can you talk a little bit about what those phases are and what they mean?
Yes, so you're correct. There are actually 4 phases in the sort of clinical trial language. Phase 1 is an early phase study, and it typically involves a relatively small group of healthy volunteers for the most part, and that focuses on assessing the safety, the dosage, and the potential side effect of the intervention. They're not always in healthy volunteers, so it's not uncommon that in the cancer field, that some of these phase 1 studies are done in cancer patients. And so every drug, once it's gone through what we call the preclinical phase, which is when it's been tested in different animal models or in vitro, then it goes through this phase 1 to understand, as I mentioned before, the safety, maybe different doses, and the side effects that can be seen with that intervention. A phase 2 trial is more comprehensive, and it expands to a larger group of participants, usually individuals with the target health condition. So for instance, if we're talking about cancer cachexia, phase 2 will typically involve somebody that has cancer and cachexia. And the primary goal of these type of studies is usually to evaluate the safety, but begin to assess also the effectiveness of the intervention. It's not that phase 1s don't look at that, but usually the numbers are so small that it's hard to draw conclusions. Here on a phase 2 study, you can start doing that and see, for instance, whether this intervention can impact your weight, your appetite, your fatigue level, your muscle strength. So those would be examples of effectiveness in the area of cancer cachexia, in addition to evaluating safety. So safety typically means, for instance, looking at blood work to make sure that your kidney and your liver function is okay, as well as talking to the patients and asking them whether they've experienced any particular sign or symptom that is not expected. Moving on to a phase 3 study, these are typically larger studies that involves a more diverse group of participants, and that is designed to provide a more comprehensive sort of data set looking at both, again, safety and efficacy. These are typically the studies that are done to get a drug approved in the market, and those type of studies are called registration trials when they're actually designed for that purpose of getting regulatory approval. Traditionally, these studies involves comparisons to a placebo group, and sometimes also include what we call standard treatments of standard of care. So for instance, if the standard of care in a certain group of patients, for instance, in cancer cachexia, is to visit with a dietitian and be referred to physical therapy, then everybody undergoes that. And then they're what we call randomized, which is allocate in a fashion that is random to either a drug, let's say, or an intervention. That could be nutritional supplement, or it could be a device, or an exercise intervention, or a placebo. Typically, both the patients and the investigators are blinded, meaning they don't know which group they belong to. And then there's also a blinded comparison between two groups. Those results are then typically put forth to regulators, the FDA in the United States, or the European Medicines Agency, EMA, and in the EU, for instance, for evaluation and see if these studies warrant the approval of a treatment, taking into account both safety and efficacy. These studies usually take years to perform and also to plan. And in the planning phase, usually regulators are also involved. So this is not something that is only designed and then gets to the regulator the moment that the results are available. They've been working with investigators and with the sponsor funding the study through the process. Once the drug is approved, they may undergo still more testing, and that's usually called phase 4. This is also known as post-marketing surveillance. And this involves monitoring the intervention's long-term safety and also the efficacy in a larger population. These studies are being done more commonly these days to address a couple of instances. One is to look at the side effects that perhaps are rare enough, and so they were not picked up on a phase 3. So let's say that in a phase 3 study, there were 1,000 patients that were treated, but there's one side effect that is important, but that happens 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 patients. So you may not see a single case on your phase 3 and that drug be approved, and yet you will still see it in clinical practice. So in order to get some of that data that requires sort of a larger data set, is that phase 4 studies are performed. Also, the clinical trials are done in a controlled fashion, and usually there's strict criteria to get into, to not get into in a clinical trials. And clinical practice is more laxed. And so you also want to know if not only the safety, but also the efficacy of your intervention is seen in real practice. And these phase 4 studies are used for that.
Great, thanks for that explanation. So you already touched on this a little bit, regarding patients being screened for risk, but in general, is participating in a clinical trial considered a risky thing at any of the phases?
Very important question, of course. Participating in clinical trials involve potential benefits and risks for participants. And I would say that in medicine, in general, there's not an intervention that is devoid from risks. And it's hard to predict who will have a side effect. And sometimes it's hard to predict who will benefit from it. So this is worth considering when you are thinking of participating in clinical trials. Some of the benefits may include access to new treatments. So sometimes when you have cancer, you go through what is considered the standard treatments, and sometimes there are no more options unless you enroll in a study that is looking at new treatments for a particular disease. And so this is one potential benefit of participating in a clinical trial. Of course, this is how we know and how we move science forward. So there's also a great benefit to science and to the general population in which participating in clinical trials is the only way in which we enhance medical knowledge and we find answers to these difficult questions sometimes. Another potential benefit is that patients in a clinical trial are usually monitored carefully. And so it will force you to come into the hospital to get blood work, to talk to your doctors, and there's a certain benefit of being closely monitored as well. As we were discussing before, there are also some potential risks. And one of them could include some side effects that are unknown. And that's part of the reason why we test new interventions, is to find out what are those potential side effects. There's also the possibility that a treatment is ineffective. And so that's also something that has to be considered. Some of these studies will involve procedures, and those procedures can be burdensome. A lot of the patients that we see in clinic live far away or are already tired, have a busy schedule, and agreeing to participate in a clinical trial can become a burden for them. So that's important to consider at the time of signing up for a study. There's also something that is in everybody's mind these days, which is the issue of confidentiality. So certain information will be provided to your trial. And so there's always the potential loss of confidentiality, just like there is in anything we do in life when we provide information. Of course, that clinical trials go to great lengths to protect participants from these potential risks. And there are ethical guidelines, as I was mentioning before, and regulatory processes that are in place to protect individuals that are participating or that are thinking of participating in a clinical trial. All these potential risks and benefits are included in what is called the informed consent document. And this is a document that will be provided to potential participants and will be discussed in length between the research team and the potential subject to make sure that the subjects have a good understanding of what these risks and potential benefits are. Again, because this process of research in clinical trials is completely voluntary, nobody should feel pressure to accept to participate in a trial if they think that their risks are just too high for them, or the trial is simply not something that they're interested on. They can always take the consent form with them, ask all the questions, go home, think about it, talk with their loved ones, and then come back and make a decision. This will not impact their medical care. That's also important for patients to understand. Something that I always also recommend patients is that they talk to their regular healthcare providers, which may not be involved in that particular research, and say, hey, I've been offered to participate in this clinical trial. What do you think of it? Do you think I should enroll? Do you have any concerns? What are those concerns? Getting a second opinion is always a good idea.
That's a good segue into this final question, which is, if somebody is interested in learning about or participating in a clinical trial, what's the best way for them to learn about them and talk to somebody about how to get involved potentially?
Yeah, so there are a number of online resources. It includes websites such as clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website maintained by the U.S. National Library of Medicine. And actually, most of the clinical trials that are performed are required, depending on the funding, to be included in there and where they're being done in the world. And this is a pretty comprehensive database of clinical trials worldwide. Although sometimes you have to know how to navigate the system too, in order to find all the trials that you may potentially qualify for. Some of the things information that you can enter in there include the medical condition or the location where you're interested to look for a trial, or some other criteria. So for instance, your age, right? There are trials that are specific for children. There are others that are specific for adults. Of course, as I was mentioning before, healthcare professionals are also a good resource for trials. And so, for instance, if you have cancer and cachexia, you're probably receiving treatment from an hematologist or an oncologist. So that provider may be aware of clinical trials that are ongoing, either at your medical center or somewhere else where you can go and talk to people. So those will be probably the two main sources of information for clinical trials. There are certain patient advocacy groups, and they tend to be disease specific, where they may offer some sort of patient navigator services, where if you're interested in a clinical trial, you can register with them, and then they can try and find trials that are available based on your specific situation where you could enroll.
If a patient were to find a clinical trial that they were interested in on the clinicaltrials.gov website, how would they go about trying to contact the person in charge of that trial to see if they might be a good candidate?
Yeah, so the contact information is provided in this website, and all of them will have either a phone number or an email that you can reach out to the team and ask to be contacted if the trial is enrolling patients, and so you can then discuss the participation. Sometimes it will be hard to know if you fully qualify for the study until you talk to the research team, and sometimes until you go in for a visit. That's not always the case, but it's difficult to see which studies you will qualify for sure. It's sometimes easier to see which studies you will not qualify for based on these basic criteria, like your disease or your age. But some of these other more fine details, you probably would need to talk to the team to find out if you qualify or not.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having this discussion today, Dr. Garcia. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you, Martin. And thank you for doing this. I think all our patients and their families really appreciate it.